Jonathan, thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yes, well, thank you for having me on again. So my name is Jonathan Hill. I teach and research philosophy of religion at the University of Exeter. And I have a background in, philosophy and theology. I've kind of oscillated between them. And at the moment, I mainly work in the area of analytic theology, which basically means looking at particular religious beliefs and trying to think about them philosophically. So do they make sense? What's the best way of understanding them? Are they coherent? Could they be true? And things like that. Whereas traditionally, philosophy of religion has tended to focus on sort of big general things like the existence of God and life after death and things like that. In analytic theology, we look at particular beliefs of particular religions.
Cool. And so the topic today was is the incarnation coherent? So what is the incarnation? What is your standard of coherency? Is it just no logical contradiction? Because that's a pretty low bar.
Well, that's a good question. So, yeah, when I tell people I write about the incarnation, they always say, oh, reincarnation, that's really interesting. And I have to say, no, not reincarnation. The incarnation is less cool. So the doctrine of incarnation in a Christian context is God has become incarnate as a human being. So incarnate just means enfleshed, if you like. But it means more sort of specifically God actually becoming a human being. And of course, in Christianity, Jesus is supposed to be God made man. So he is fully divine and also fully human. I should say, by the way, that I say that's what Christians believe. Any statement like that has to be taken sort of with a pinch of salt, because there's nothing that all Christians believe. Whatever it is, you can find some Christians who don't believe it. Even the existence of God, because Christian humanism is a thing, not a very big thing, but it is a thing. So any
Much
statement,
like philosophers.
yeah, well, yeah, like philosophers, there's nothing all philosophers agree on. Probably. So when I say Christians believe this about Jesus, take that to mean sort of most of them, largely ignoring the tricky ones. So Jesus is supposed to be fully human and fully divine. And more broadly, of course, incarnation is an idea that isn't only found in Christianity. Hindu avatars are kind of similar. There's a similar belief in Wiccan practice, which I've written about when I sort of took a holiday from Christianity. But I'm interested in it mainly in a Christian context. So yes, so Jesus is supposed to be fully human and fully divine. He is God made human. And when we look at that in an analytic theology sort of context or a philosophical context, the question is, what does it mean to say that somebody is fully divine and fully human? Is it coherent to say that someone can be fully divine and fully human? Because fairly obviously there are fairly obvious problems with that on the face of it. And what's the best way of understanding it? Because there are lots of different ways that different Christian theologians have come up with.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is obviously you can't have a ball that is both fully red and fully green. And saying that something is fully divine and fully human seems to fit that criterion. Because part of being human is not being divine, and part of being divine being not being human, in the same way that being red is not being green. And so what would it mean and I guess it kind of also depends on your definition of God. If you see it as like a spaceless, timeless, perfect aseity, Thomistic, classical theism view, does it make sense to say such a thing could have an incarnation in a physical contingent being? That would also seem to be a direct contradiction of properties in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. So God classically is supposed to be omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly perfectly good, eternal, immaterial, this is classical theism, of course. There are theists and there have been theists who disagree with any or all of those things, but still, classically, that's what it's supposed to be. And humans, it
And
seems, are not those.
unchanging, that's an important one. Unchanging.
Unchanging, yes. Impassible, yes. God does not change. Whereas human beings are physical, limited, imperfect, change, and all those things. So yeah, it looks like you've got directly contradictory properties being ascribed to one and the same individual, which is incoherent. And that is that's something that's been used as a criticism of Christianity by non-Christians since, from atheists since at least the 18th century, and I'm sure earlier. But interestingly, it's like in more recent years, it's more commonly been dealt with in a theological context as objections by other Christians. So in the 70s, for example, there was a very influential book called The Myth of God Incarnate, edited by John Hick, a Christian theologian, in which a whole bunch of Christian theologians said, basically, the doctrine of incarnation is incoherent for the reasons just given, so we need to try and find a way to do without it, which, needless to say, inspired controversy among other Christian theologians. So yeah, it looks problematic. That said, though, it's not an issue that Orthodox, with a small o, Christians are unaware of. I mean, all the way back to the ancient formulations of the doctrine of incarnation, there is attention drawn to its paradoxical nature. He is undying and yet dies, and so on. So it's not a problem that people aren't aware of. And yeah, there are a bunch of ways of getting around it. So, for example, here is a nice way that I think works well for at least some of the issues. Yes, I can see the chat, but because I was pontificating, I wasn't looking at it very very clearly. When I say small o Orthodox, I mean broadly within the mainstream of Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant, as opposed to capital O Orthodox, which is Russian and Greek and so on. So here's one answer. This is an answer that was given by Thomas Morris, who is an American philosopher of religion who wrote a book in the 80s called The Logic of God Incarnate, which is incredibly good. I don't agree with most of what he says in it. I mean, I don't believe in the incarnation. I'm not a theist. I'm not religious. So I don't actually believe in any of this, just in case anyone thinks I do, because I'm arguing too vehemently for it. I don't have a horse in this game, in this race, really. But I think Morris's book is very good because in it, he basically takes to task those theologians who had said the doctrine of incarnation is incoherent. Let's rethink Christianity without it. Morris said, well, maybe not. You need to look at it more carefully. And Morris said that people say God has all of these amazing properties. Human beings lack them. But how do you know those are essential human properties? So take the property of having limited knowledge, for example. God is omniscient. We are not omniscient. Therefore, you can't be both human and divine. But you don't know that being not omniscient is essential to human nature. Maybe as a matter of contingent fact, no human beings ever have been omniscient, but that doesn't mean they couldn't be without losing their humanity, assuming omniscience is possible in the first place. And same thing with the others. Could a human being be omnipotent and still remain human? Well, there's no obvious reason to deny that, or to say it rather. So Morris says that if you think there are good reasons to think that Christianity are true, which is quite a big if, then there's nothing wrong, there's nothing irrational about taking the apparent truth of the incarnation to drive your view of human nature rather than the other way around. So instead of saying, this is what God's like, this is what human beings are like, they seem to be incompatible, instead we should say, let's assume the truth of the incarnation. From that, we can say divinity and humanity are compatible. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, so if you identify certain properties that aren't necessary in being a human, then it's not a contradiction to have those properties and be a human.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and who says it is necessary to human nature to be limited in knowledge or morally imperfect and so on? So I
Christians,
think
typically.
I think he makes a fair case. The problem is, of course, there are some properties where it doesn't really work. I mean, for example, it is surely essential to human nature to be embodied and temporal, whereas God, at least classically, is not embodied and temporal. And there's a worse problem as well, which is that even if you accept Thomas Morris's account of having this fairly fluid account of human nature, it becomes problematic. I mean, that might work sort of in the abstract. You might say, okay, in the abstract, there is no incoherence about the idea of someone who is both human and divine. But it doesn't work so well when you think, how do you apply it to Jesus? Because Jesus is the person we're supposedly interested in here. And Jesus, according to the Gospels, was ignorant of some things. There are some things Jesus is described as not knowing. He even claims not to know certain things. There are some things Jesus is described as being unable to do. Mark's Gospel says that Jesus was unable to perform any miracles in a certain place, so he went somewhere else. And Matthew, who bases his gospel on Mark, doesn't like that. He changes it. He changes it to say Jesus didn't do any miracles in that place, so he went somewhere else. But Mark says he couldn't. So if you take the New Testament portrayal of Jesus seriously, it looks like Jesus lacks knowledge, some knowledge. He lacks abilities, at least some abilities. He is physical. He is in a certain time and place, and he changes. He grows. He grows in wisdom, according to Luke's gospel. So all of those things seem very hard to reconcile with at least a classical view of what God is supposed to be like. So kind of the Thomas Morris approach, I think, is quite ingenious in clearing out some of the problems, but it can't really deal with the claim that Jesus is fully human and fully divine, I think.
Yeah, change seems to be also an important one, like, a spaceless, timeless mind becoming a human mind seems to be a problem, especially if it can't change. It will all what it
Mm,
means to be human is to have different thoughts, and that seems to be change of some kind. So change definitely seems to be an intrinsic property of humans also.
mm. I mean, so sorry, were you going to say something else there?
Go ahead.
Okay, because otherwise I don't want it to be just a monologue. Well, I mean, I could quite happily make it just a monologue, but maybe other people wouldn't want that. Well, so here's another approach, which is kind of the opposite of Thomas Morris's approach. So Thomas Morris says, let's redefine humanity to be a lot vaguer. What if you redefine divinity? So, so Catherine Tanner suggests this. She's a theologian rather than a philosopher, so she doesn't really develop it with great sort of precision, I think, but it's a possible approach. So, suppose you say God has things like knowledge and power and changelessness and all these other things, but they are not the same things as what we normally refer to by those words. So, for example, I have knowledge, I know stuff. God has knowledge, but God's knowledge, it's not just like my knowledge, but more of it or better. It's something fundamentally different. It's a different kind of thing. And so we call it knowledge kind of analogically, by analogy. God's knowledge is, we understand it by analogy to our knowledge, but it's not the same thing exactly. And the same thing goes for power and goodness and all these other things. So this is a view of God that goes back, at least to Thomas Aquinas. He kind of makes it central to his idea of God. Any words that we apply to God are applied by analogy. They're not applied literally. Well, I mean, it predates Aquinas. It goes back to Pseudo Dionysius, at least. So then you can say, right, so one person might have limited knowledge, human knowledge, but unlimited divine knowledge, because in the context of God, the word knowledge refers to something different from what it refers to in a human context. And then you could have these, call it knowledge H for human knowledge and knowledge D for divine knowledge. Jesus can have limited limited knowledge H and unlimited knowledge D, because knowledge H and knowledge D are not the same things.
To me, that seems to cause a problem of ambiguity, because I could say, like, my cup has all of those properties, knowledge H. If there's no, if you don't actually have a specific definition of what that could mean, simply saying that it has all of this new kind of knowledge, but it doesn't in any way resemble what we mean by the word, it kind of makes it arbitrary, an arbitrary property that could apply to literally anything, because we have no idea what it means anymore. And then we could just say literally anybody has this property, or anything has this property.
Yes, but is that a huge problem? I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to think of a good analogy to kind of defend the idea. I'm not sure I can think of one. But yeah, if someone says, I mean, so this is a common objection. If it's not knowledge like we have, then in what sense is it knowledge at all? Which kind of is the same objection, I think, but sort of from a different angle. Suppose we say God has knowledge, but it's not like our knowledge. Well, why call it knowledge? Why not call it just blah or anything? And some theologians would go down that route. Like, I mentioned just now Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who had one of the best names in theology, and that's really saying something. Pseudo-Dionysius was round in the early 6th century or thereabouts, and he's called Pseudo-Dionysius because he pretended to be Dionysius the Areopagite, who's a minor character in the book of Acts, and he wrote all these books in the persona of Dionysius. And people for centuries thought he really was Dionysius the Areopagite, but he wasn't. He was just someone pretending. Anyway, Pseudo-Dionysius, as we now call him, was very influential on later thought, partly because people thought he really was this character from the New Testament. And he said, yes, when you're talking about God, God literally transcends every word and every thought you can apply to God. So we say of God, God is not physical, God is not evil, obviously. But then you go beyond that and say, God is not spiritual either. God is not even good. God is not one. God is not three. God is not a trinity. God is not anything. And you even deny those. So you say it's not the case that God is not those things. That's double denial. And it's a kind of, deliberately incoherent view of God, because God transcends all possible understanding. And of course, that gets you out of all sorts of problems, but it gives you all sorts of problems as well, because now God just doesn't seem to be anything at all. And arguably, that view is pretty close to atheism, and some theologians who have developed those ideas, Meister Eckhart, particularly in the 14th century, were accused of atheism because they defined God out of any meaning altogether, pretty much.
Yeah, that seems to be a problem, because if you're trying to say that these properties fuse and they use the same word to refer to those properties, but they're somehow completely different from one another.
Yeah.
It definitely seems to cause a problem. Coherency.
It does, and it's arguably incoherent as well, because someone like Thomas Aquinas, he doesn't go as far as that, right? So Aquinas will say, I have knowledge, God has knowledge. God's knowledge isn't the same sort of thing as mine. However, they are similar enough that it makes sense to use the same word. So there is some analogy, right? It's the doctrine of analogy. God is analogous to earthly things, although fundamentally different. And then Duns Scotus came along and he said, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're going to say that God's knowledge is similar to my knowledge, then there must be properties that God's knowledge and my knowledge both have. Otherwise, you couldn't say they're similar at all. And if you're going to say that, then there must be properties that God and I have in common, like literally in common, in the same sense. Otherwise, you couldn't use this analogical language at all. And so that kind of collapsed the whole thing. And Scotus's arguments, I mean, even today, I think a lot of people are, well, I at least am quite convinced by them. I think Scotus kind of did undermine Thomas's view quite well. And that, at least to my mind, that does undermine this sort of approach to dealing with incarnation, I think. So yeah, I basically, that's a really long-winded way of saying I agree with you. If you're going to insulate divine properties from human properties to such a degree that you can't even use the same words, then what's the point, basically?
So I was imagining like this define aseity thing, the classical Thomistic view. If it is perfect, unchanged, and I kind of imagine it's like a singularity of some kind, just a physics point. Could I essentially just put that in the brain of a person and say they are now combined? They're now fully divine and fully human. There's a singularity, just plop it in your brain, kind of like John Travolta style in that one movie where he got really smart because he had a brain tumor or something. And now, poof, you have a divine being that is also human.
Maybe it'd be more like being John Malkovich. You put a whole room inside someone's head. All right, well, let's run with that then. So what do you mean by putting it inside their head? You mean like physically locating it inside their brain?
Yes, or their soul in this case, because they have a soul. So they have some kind of soul location, soul space, and this thing is fused inside of the soul space.
All right, so that is quite close to the traditional view of incarnation, pretty much, and the sort of way of getting around it. So like I said, the doctrine of incarnation, Jesus is God and human. And there are different ways of fleshing that out. That's a hilarious incarnation pun for anyone paying attention.
We're going to make it into a bread thing and serve it out at Mass.
Exactly. So the traditional view is this: Jesus has a human body and a human soul. And I use the word soul very vaguely here. And in fact, everything I'm saying, you could translate it into materialist language. So when I say body and soul, I mean all the bits that a human being has, whether those are physical, non-physical, or whatever. But it works if you take soul to be just a fancy way of referring to, a mind or a brain, if you want to be really physicalist about it. So Jesus has a human. He's got all the bits a human being has. Those bits are assumed by God the Son, the second person of the Trinity. So God the Son acquires a human body and soul, if there be such a thing, and sort of operates through them. So you've got kind of literally two bits to Christ. You've got the human body, soul, mind, whatever, and you've got the second person of the Trinity who's kind of glued onto them, like stuck on metaphysically. And the reason why theologians developed that way of thinking of it is because they wanted to preserve the changelessness of God. Like you mentioned before, God is changeless. But a human being, even a perfect human being like Jesus, changes. At the very least, Jesus moves around, he walks, he talks, he does things. Those are changes. He stands up, he sits down. Those are changes. God shouldn't do that. Well, God doesn't have to do that. The human bits are doing that, but the divine bit remains outside space and time, assuming you think God is outside space and time, because again, not everyone thinks that, but assume that for the sake of argument. God is unchanging, God is impassive, and so on. But he's got this other bit that's sort of moving around. So it's like the best analogy I can think of all sorts of crazy analogies, but think of Avatar, right? In Avatar, Jake, the protagonist, is inside this sort of machine thing, and he can't walk. But he's controlling this avatar that allows him to, run around crazy alien jungles and get jiggy with crazy blue alien women and so on, right? Now, in a sense, Jake is not doing those things. He's trapped inside the machine that allows him to control it. The avatar is off doing those things. But in another sense, Jake is doing those things because he is so united with the avatar that he sees what it sees and so on. So The Incarnation's a bit like that. God the Son is not literally walking around on earth talking to people and doing stuff. God the Son is outside time, outside space. He does not, think discursively like we do. He doesn't talk like we do. He doesn't act like we do. He certainly doesn't suffer. Jesus does all of those things. But because of the union of the divine and the human, the hypostatic union, as it's called, um, Jesus's experiences are God's experiences, because God the Son is the only person involved in the Incarnation. The human body and soul do not constitute a person in their own right. My body and soul constitute a person in their own right. Your body and soul constitute a person, but Jesus's body and soul do not constitute a person for reasons that remain obscure. And so the only person involved in all of this setup is God the Son. So it's God the Son who has the experiences that are going on in Jesus' brain.
And does that cause a problem with, like, it seems like Jesus becomes a pea zombie of some kind at this point. Just his body and soul are now a philosophical zombie, essentially.
No, because he has qualia. Remember, Jesus has got everything that makes a human being. So whatever you think a human being consists of, that's what Jesus is. That's what he's got. And he has fully human experiences just like we do. It's just that the person having those experiences is God the Son, sort of at one remove. Just like Jake is having the experiences of his avatar at one remove, as it were. But they're still genuine human experiences. And in virtue of the fact that God the Son is united to this, to Jesus, God the Son can be said to be a human. So he genuinely becomes human. He's not just like piggybacking on a human. He's not just sticking an electrode into a human and sort of observing what's going on. He is a human because of this, though he is a human in a way that is unusual, certainly unique, in fact.
Well, so bringing up questions of the Trinity, does that mean that there are multiple qualia in the God being? The aseity Father thing has a qualia, and then Jesus has a qualia?
The Son is the only one who is incarnate. So everything gets more complicated when you bring the Trinity in, obviously, because let's not go down the Trinity rabbit hole as much as we can avoid it, right? Suffice to say, there are three persons: God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit. They are not the same as each other. They are distinct. They are different persons. Nonetheless, they're all one God. And don't ask me to explain that, because no one can. I mean, I could try, but that would be another conversation altogether.
Well, then, so like incarnation could then be something like the Greek or Roman gods, where it's like a DNA of some kind, and you have divine DNA that is imparted onto children, and they then have the divine attribute to it. Would that?
No, because then you're making something special about the physicality of Jesus. So Jesus isn't supposed. He's not a hybrid. He's not like Mr. Spock. He's not got divine parentage and human parentage, and then they sort of combine, and you get this half and half. I mean, although obviously, at least in traditional Christianity, there's the virgin birth and so on. It's not. That's not what makes Jesus divine.
Well, to me, because that sounded like, in the way that you described it, that seemed like exactly like what it would be analogous to, is that there's some divine spark thingy out there, and it's imparted onto your soul, kind of like divine DNA or something, and then poof.
No, because Jesus' soul is not different from anyone else's. I mean, it's unusual in many respects, but it's a normal human soul. The only respect in which Jesus' soul differs from yours, at least the only important respect, is that he never sins. And possibly he has access to all kinds of knowledge that normal people don't have, possibly. Some theologians think that, some don't. But, leave that to one side for a moment. He's got a normal soul, because if he didn't have a normal soul, he wouldn't be fully human. So there was so just to illustrate this, there was a controversy about this in the 4th century. There'd just been a massive controversy in the 4th century over the Arian controversy, which was pretty big. But then this little one sort of came tagged on at the end to do with Apollinaris of Laodicea. And Apollinaris of Laodicea said, Jesus has got a normal body and a normal soul, except for the mind. So in ancient psychology, of course, the soul is whatever makes you alive. You know, it's not necessarily something distinct from the body. It could be the structure of the body, as in Aristotelianism, or it could be a physical thing throughout the body, as in Stoicism. But Jesus, according to Apollinaris, has got a normal soul. Apart from the mind, he doesn't have a human mind. And he thought God the Son displaces the mind. So God the Son acts as Jesus's mind. So Jesus is basically walking around controlled by God the Son in the same way that my mind controls me. And he got condemned for this because it's almost impossible to say anything on this topic without getting condemned one way or another. He got condemned because people said, if you say that Jesus didn't have a completely human soul with all of the normal bits that everyone else does, then God didn't really become a human being. He became a sort of half and half. And if God didn't really become a human being and really assume all the bits of a human being, then humanity cannot be saved, because ancient Christians typically thought that salvation is a matter of God like joining himself to humanity and changing humanity and raising humanity up to become divinized. Athanasius said God became man so that man might become God. If God didn't properly become man, then that couldn't happen. So that's why Apollinarianism got condemned, and why ever since then Christians have always, with that qualification, Christians have always opposed any idea that Jesus lacks anything of humanity or is fundamentally different in any way, even a small way, from other human beings.
So then how does he have access to this extra knowledge? Where is the divine part?
So the divine part is distinct from the human part, right? They're not mixed. Jesus isn't a compound. He's like two elements kept separate, but they are united in a way that remains mysterious. And there are various analogies that different theologians have come up with to explain it. So
just initially, if they're separate, how does he have access to the knowledge?
Sorry, I shouldn't say separate, distinct. They're not separate because they're united. So how does he have access to the knowledge? Okay, well, assuming that he does have access to supernatural knowledge, and not every theologian thinks this. In fact, I mean, traditionally in Catholic theology, and still today, I think in Catholic theology, there's this idea that Jesus had access to practically all knowledge. Like, Jesus in his humanity was walking around like knowing everything a human being can possibly know. Protestant theologians don't like that idea as a rule, and they are much more prepared to say that Jesus in his humanity was ignorant of pretty much everything that you'd expect anyone to be ignorant of from that time and place. But supposing you say that he did have super knowledge, there's a couple of ways. So Thomas Aquinas, again, he has this fantastic idea of Jesus's knowledge, which is just, to my mind, is just like pure fantasy. It's like this is like theology as sort of wish fulfillment, really. So he thinks that Jesus, and I should bear in mind as well, in this whole sort of way of seeing things, Jesus has two minds, right? He has a human mind, and that's distinct from his divine minds that the divine Son has. So in his human mind, Jesus has several kinds of knowledge. He's got acquired knowledge, which is normal knowledge that you learn by going around and looking at stuff and learning, right? Like we all do. He also has infused knowledge. So this means that God acts upon Jesus's human mind and gives him access to vast amounts of knowledge. He also enjoys the beatific vision at all times. So Jesus is walking around aware at every given moment of the full glory of God that for the rest of us, we have to wait until we get to heaven to see. And that's just in his human mind. Jesus has got those. Of course, in his divine mind, he's omniscient anyway. So the answer basically is God miraculously provides that knowledge to Jesus in his humanity.
Well, how is that different from the DNA case? So there's this divine stuff that is then imparted, that is fused with the mind soul of Jesus. How is that different from if it was DNA as opposed to knowledge?
Because DNA would change the nature of Jesus's soul. It would make it so that it has this sort of magic power of its own. Jesus's soul doesn't have any magic powers of its own. All the magic comes from God directly. So, so it's not like God sort of jumps inside Mary's womb, starts Jesus going with special magic powers because he's interfered with the DNA, and then jumps out again and leaves Jesus to sort of develop as this kind of Superman, right? It's not like that. Jesus develops normally as a, inside Mary's womb, and later on he's a totally normal human being, but God is acting on him all the time. So it's like a constant miracle, if you like. It's not like one miracle at the start that gives him superpowers. It's like a constant miracle all the time throughout Jesus's life that that gives him access to this extra stuff.
So kind of like in the Roman and Greek mythologies, if I was holding one of the objects that would make me divine, kind of like that.
Yeah, I suppose. Or it's like, well, again, think of Avatar, right? The Avatar knows stuff about human beings that a normal Na'vi wouldn't know, because, well, it's not a very great analogy, because the Avatar doesn't have a mind of its own, whereas Jesus
Yeah. So
does. And
yeah,
that's sort
that's
of,
the P zombie thing. It wouldn't know anything.
yeah. But Jesus does, right? I mean, Jesus does know things as a human being, distinct from what he knows as a as divine, just to make things complicated. Anyway, the whole point of all of this, which is why I started talking about it, is if you accept all of this as coherent, and I'm aware that's quite a big if, it allows you to deal with the incoherent sort of problem nicely. Because now you can say all the human properties, Jesus has got those, and all the divine properties, the divine Son has got those. And they're one and the same person, of course, because of the incarnation. So, for example, Jesus, and when I say Jesus here, I mean the human body and soul part, might well not be omnipotent, right? Jesus might well be unable to do stuff. Jesus might well not know stuff. So take a more trendy Protestant sort of view of the incarnation and say Jesus doesn't know anything that a normal human being wouldn't know. Jesus didn't know how to speak French or ride a bicycle, or how to change a car battery and stuff like that, because of
How
course he
how
did.
how
Because
germs work to wash your
yeah,
hands.
right. That would be ridiculous. Jesus didn't know that the world goes around the sun. Jesus probably held many beliefs that were false. Jesus probably believed that the sun goes around the earth. He probably believed the world was only a few thousand years old, and so on. All the things that a normal person at that time might have been expected to know. But a typical Protestant theologian would probably say that doesn't matter. That doesn't stop him being divine, because the divine Son is where all the omniscience is, if you like. You insulate off the human properties from the divine properties. So Jesus is perhaps lacking in knowledge, lacking in power. He's physical, he's temporal, he changes, he suffers. God the Son doesn't do any of those things, strictly speaking. God the Son is omniscient, omnipotent, perfect, and so on. God the Son does not suffer in himself. He has all of Jesus's experiences. He is the one who has them, but he has them in Jesus, if you like. He outsources all of that stuff to Jesus, and that keeps his divinity intact. So that is why, and that is why Christian theologians developed this view of the incarnation, because they wanted to say Jesus is God, but they didn't want to say God suffers in himself and all the rest of it. So sort of this two natures view is the kind of what you're forced into if you want to affirm both of those things without contradiction.
There still seems to be a problem with saying that they're separate, yet they can still one can still experience what the other one is experiencing, or some indirect connection that way, because they can't be fully separate if they are if
No, they're
the
not.
one is experiencing the other one, which means
Yeah.
there has to be some way in which they're connected and attached.
So the Council of Chalcedon, which is what laid down the orthodox view on all of this in 451, and which was supposed to be like the final word that was going to sort it all out, but in fact, of course, just created something for people to carry on arguing over ever since. It says it says Christ is one person with two natures, and these two natures are, oh God, what does it actually say? They are not mingled, they are not mixed, but they are not separated either. So they are distinct but united. And what that means is
So like oil and water in a cup.
a bit like that. So they don't mix like oil and water, but they are unite. You know, they're not just next to each other. So one analogy for this, which goes back to oh God, who does it go back to? One of those medieval types, Henry of Ghent. Henry of Ghent says this, I think, as a shout out to all the Henry of Ghent fans who might be listening to this. Henry of Ghent was a philosopher and theologian who came a bit after Aquinas and basically took lots of Aquinas's ideas and did weird things with them. And he says, at least I think he says, I'm suddenly thinking, was it him who said this? I'm pretty sure it's him who says, it's a bit like substance and accident. So if you think of a substance, you know, say this book, for example, one of its properties is its greenness. Now, the greenness is not the same thing as the book, right? You could repaint the book and it wouldn't be green anymore, but the book would still exist. So the greenness is an accident of the book in scholastic terminology. It's an accidental property. It's a property that the book has, but which is not identical with the book. Moreover, you couldn't have the greenness without the book. You couldn't have just greenness floating about by itself in a weird amorphous way. You've got to have a thing which is green. Well, Henry says that Christ's humanity is kind of like that. It doesn't have any existence in its own right. It's not a substance. My humanity is a substance. Yours is, I mean, you know, I am a substance. I'm a thing that exists in my own right. Same thing is true of you and of everyone else. But of Jesus, that is uniquely not the case. Jesus does not exist as a substance. He exists a bit like an accidental property of something. So that's to say that the human body and soul, all the human bits, the human nature, if you like, is exists. It's impossible to say really. It requires something else in order to exist in a way that normal human bodies and souls do not. And that's
sounds like a pea zombie. Pea zombies would be like the accidental properties of humans, but they're not what makes a human. It's the conscious experience that makes a human. And so without that, you have all accidental properties. But if you have a conscious quality experience, then that seems to be what makes you a human, what makes you a real.
Oh, well, that's a qualitative difference. I mean, a pea zombie would still be a substance, right? I mean, it would still be a thing. Yeah. I mean, I'm using substance in the classical sense, you know, to mean a thing that exists just in its own right without needing something else to depend on.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Jesus is qualitatively like any other human. He has all the same experiences and physical properties and so on as any other human. But he doesn't have existence in his own right in the way that other humans do. He only exists as dependent upon God the Son, in a way that is obscure, right? But not, I mean, it's obviously obscure, right? There's no good analogy for it. The substance accidental property thing is just an analogy. But in its defense, I'd say it's not obviously incoherent either, I think. Um, I
Would that be
mean,
different from how like Calvinists think that God sustains everything in existence at all times, and if God disappeared, everything would disappear, and so we're all kind of in a way contingent on God sustaining us in this way?
yeah, and that's a very good point because I mean, it's not only Calvinists who think that. That's a fairly standard Christian view. Yes, so in a sense, in mainstream Christianity, there is no such the only substance in the classical sense is God because everything else depends upon God for its existence. So in a sense, we all do. In which case, what's special about Jesus in that case? Because it now looks like we all depend upon God for our existence, and that's no different um, from Jesus's human nature. So there must be some more kind of more intimate dependence and connection between Jesus's human nature and God than there is between other created things of God. But yeah, I agree. That is an obscurity with it that needs explaining. Well, I know. I mean, to be fair, it doesn't necessarily need explaining. I mean, we're talking about
God
God.
works in mysterious ways. That's it.
God
That's the
does work in
solution.
mysterious ways, and I'm very sympathetic to the criticism that says you've explained it all until you can't explain it anymore, and then you fall back and say it's a mystery, and now we can't explain it, and that's not much of an account, right? But at the same time, assuming that it's legitimate to talk about God and so on in the first place, it's not unreasonable to think there could be some mystery about it. Um, I mean, the kind of the traditional account that I've just given, which, like I say, is the view of most medieval theologians and most classical ones. It's not, at least to my mind, it's not obviously incoherent. There's no point at which you say P and not P. There's no inconsistency.
So I have a question about that specifically.
Mm,
So if we use the same justifications the Christians have, why wouldn't this work for round squares and an object that is fully red and fully green? We could just say, take the exact same Christian arguments that there is some mysterious aligning property between the essence of redness, which is not exactly like redness as we think of it, it's only analogous in some way, and it doesn't impose on the nature of the greenness of the ball, but it's somehow like attached but not attached, like oil and water,
mm,
and so it's fully red and fully green at the same time. Like, couldn't we use all of these arguments to make a direct logical contradiction seem coherent? And if
mm,
so, what what does it even mean to ask if the question is something coherent at that point when we can make any logical contradiction seem coherent in this
mm.
way? Wouldn't at that point we would have to say it is incoherent, because the same criteria could be used for any exact P and not P logical contradiction to try to make it seem coherent?
So I think that's a very good question. I think that's a good criticism. Um, if I were someone like Thomas Aquinas, um, I think I would say the incarnation is a special case because it's God, right? The incarnation isn't just one created nature and another created nature being stuck together, like a round thing and a square thing being mysteriously stuck together to make a single thing that's both round and square. It's God uniting himself to a created thing. So you can't just help yourself to any two random natures that are inconsistent and say we could, in theory, have something akin to the incarnation that unites them. Something like this only works if one of the things being united is God. And indeed, medieval philosophers did, as is their wont, get really speculative about this and say, well, could God have incarnated in something else? Could there be incarnation between a divine person and a non-human animal or a rock, right? Could God be incarnate in a rock? And I'm not sure if there was a standard answer to this, but I think, at least in theory, yes. You could, at least in theory, unite the divine nature to pretty much anything you want. If God can unite himself to humanity, then God could unite himself to whatever the noun is for rock nature. He didn't, so it never happened. But in theory, maybe. So yeah, if I were a theologian holding a sort of view, I would say it only works with God. So the idea of a square circle that's analogous to a God man isn't going to work.
But why? Because it seems kind of arbitrary to say, oh, but it's special pleading. It doesn't apply to God. It's fine. Just don't look over there. Don't look at the man behind the curtain.
Well,
Why
okay,
would
well, how would it happen then? Are you envisaging that God would miraculously unite a square thing and a round thing together in such a way that you have a unity that is both square and round?
Well, I would say not including the God property. Say that there's a property of roundness and a property of squareness
Mm.
in some platonic forms or something. And these properties can conjoin in one object in an analogous way to the way God conjoins with Jesus, in that the essence of roundness is somehow only analogous. It's not really an object that has four perpendicular sides or whatever. No, that's just an analogy of squareness,
All
and there
right.
is some
Well,
essence of squareness out there in the property of this platonic object, and it combines with the essence of roundness, but they're not actually combined. They're only analogously combined, and they're
but
only
but
like,
but remember, in the incarnation, the two natures are distinct, right?
yeah.
So we you can have you can have analogous situations. Look, here's a round thing, here's a square thing. Look, I've stuck them together. Now I've got something that's round and square, right? It's square in that bit, and it's round. And I hope you're impressed by my ability to improvise here. It's square in this bit, and it's round in this bit. Well, that's how the incarnation works as well, right? You don't have a single property bearer that is omniscient and limited in knowledge and omnipotent and limited in power. You've got
I was
part
just thinking that would be a perfect TikTok right there. You're like, here's a round, but this is how the incarnation works. I'm gonna like it's gonna be beautiful. But
yes.
that's what it sounds like to me, is that that's all that the Christian is doing, is essentially just doing that, where they take a round bit and a square bit, they stick it together. This is the incarnation, and to me
Yeah,
that does
but then
seem
it's coherent, isn't it?
sort of. But if the round bit has access to the square bit and can use the square bit sides, then it can't be fully round and fully square. And so when you
Ah,
say it's
well, so some Christian theologians would agree with that, right? And they would say, yes, if you allow Jesus in his humanity access to divine knowledge and power and stuff like that, then he's not properly human anymore. Yeah, absolutely. So let's say he doesn't, right? Maybe Jesus doesn't have access to any of that stuff. Fine, job done. But even putting that to one side, um, squareness isn't something that can be used by the round side, if you like. But knowledge is. I mean, there's nothing incoherent about saying you've got the divine Son with the divine mind that is omniscient, and glued to him, you've got this human body and mind that is limited, and the divine mind allows some of the knowledge to leak through, right? Jesus in his humanity is walking along, and suddenly bang, he's got this revelation from his divine side. I mean, because knowledge is the kind of thing that can be imparted from the omniscient to the non-omniscient, isn't it? In a way that geometry can't.
why?
I
What would
mean,
be the difference?
it's only problematic if you say that Jesus in his humanity has access to the entirety of divine omniscience, but nobody says that, not even Thomas Aquinas. He gets as close to it as he can, but he doesn't think that, because, like I say, in Mark chapter 13, Jesus says, "I don't know when the end of the
Is
world will
that
come."
possible? So if suppose classical Thomism is true, omniscience is a single aseity, there is no indivisible parts. How can you have access to a single piece of knowledge from the omniscience without having access to the entire thing if it's one thing?
Now that's a good question. But then that applies to any kind of revelation, doesn't it? If you're going, I mean, you know, I'm not God incarnate, as far as I know. If there is a God, God could presumably reveal some piece of knowledge to me, right? There could be a booming voice coming out of the sky telling me such and such. Um, Now, you might say, yes, if divine knowledge is a single unity which is identical with the divine essence, then how can God reveal anything to anybody? But then that's a general problem with revelation at all. It's not a particular problem with the incarnation. I mean, effectively,
Well, that's why, because the revelation part I don't have as much of a problem with, because you don't have a part of the omniscience in you. You're essentially just looking at the omniscience, and you can only see a tiny bit or whatever. That's fine.
oh, I
But
see.
if
No,
if
no,
it's
that's
in you, if you have a property of the omniscience in you, you can't have a partial property.
no. I see what you mean. No, I've not explained myself clearly enough. Then, so on the classical view, the human part does not have a bit of omniscience in him. You know, if I said that, I meant it as a sort of shorthand for saying he enjoys some kind of special knowledge that other people don't have, and this has been imparted to him by his omniscient divine mind. But yeah, he doesn't have a bit of omniscience stuck in him. You know,
Well, I think
like a
that's what I mean, because
splinter.
he has the divine mind with the omniscience,
Yeah,
and he has the human mind.
yeah.
But if he has the divine mind, he can't have partial knowledge in the divine mind. He has to have all of it, right?
No, the human mind could have partial knowledge of the divine mind, or no knowledge of it at all. You know, in theory,
Well, that's the part I'm
assuming
not understanding, because if for them to be the same person with the same mind.
ah, so this is yes, this is where it gets crazy. You know, all this stuff we've had so far is just run of the mill mundane stuff. So the traditional view is Jesus has two minds, right? And they are distinct. He's got a human mind and a divine mind, and they are quite distinct from each other. And yeah, you might say that makes him two persons, right? That sounds like two people.
Trinity
That's
just became a quad entity.
it's not a quadinity because the human mind isn't divine, right? It's a human mind. It's owned by a divine person, but it isn't divine in itself. Remember, in the incarnation, divinity and humanity are not mingled. They are distinct. So you've got Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Those are the members of the Trinity. Then one of them is glued to this human mind. Anyhow, yeah. So we typically think of persons as minds, right? We think that I kind of am my mind in a sort of a way. And if you had one person with two minds, that would be two persons. But in antiquity, people didn't think like that. So the classical philosophical and theological definition of a person is a substance with a rational nature, right? That's Boethius's famous definition of a person, a substance with a rational nature. And there's nothing incoherent about supposing that one person can have two minds on that definition, as long as it remains a single substance. A substance, remember, is a thing that exists in its own right, that isn't like dependent upon something else for its existence. You know, so this collection of objects is not a substance because it depends for its existence on that thing and that thing. That thing might be a substance, maybe. I mean, classically it isn't, but suppose it is. Anyhow, so a single person could have two minds if they constitute a single substance. And the fact that you have this psychological split doesn't stop it being a single person. That's how a classical philosopher or a classical theologian would interpret it. So yes, today when people are presented with this idea of Christ having two minds, they instinctively say, well, that makes him two persons. And of course, it's incredibly heretical to say that Christ is two persons. That's the Nestorian heresy. But classically, it doesn't make him two persons. Classically, Christian theologians resisted the idea that Christ is two persons, not because they were worried about having multiple psychologies sort of interacting with each other, but because they wanted Christ to be a genuine unity. And they wanted Christ to be a genuine unity because they wanted divinity and humanity to be genuinely united, because that's what saves you. Well, it's what saves everyone. If they are separate substances, then divinity cannot raise up humanity. So as long as Christ is a single being, a single entity, it doesn't matter how many minds he's got. He counts as a single person for the purposes of theological orthodoxy. That make sense?
No, but so it seems like there's like so Jesus had his corpus callosum split and his left side and his right side developed differently, or it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of a thing, or split
Well, it's not
personality
like
disorder.
it's not like Jekyll and Hyde, because that's there you have a period of being one thing followed by a period of being the other, followed by a period of being the other. It's more like the split brain thing. And in fact, Richard Swinburne, who is an avid proponent of this view, appeals to that, that kind of thing as an analogy. Not, I'm convinced, a tremendously helpful analogy, but still an analogy. So yeah, so he's got these two minds, but that's not a modern thing. That's right there. Thomas Aquinas says the same thing. It's right there throughout the Christian tradition. Ever since Apollinaris, Jesus has a human mind just like any other human mind, and that is distinct from his divine mind. They're completely distinct from each other, though he still constitutes a single person, because his human mind and his human body do not they exist only as assumed by the divinity, by God.
So that seems like Jesus's human mind is like a trapped slave of his divine mind, and we're like morally obligated to free him in some sense.
Well, you might think that, except that it gets more complicated still, because orthodoxy also says that Jesus's human mind has a will of its own that is distinct from the divine will that's part of the divine mind. Because if Jesus's humanity did not have a human will distinct from the divine will, then he would not have everything that makes up a human being. So he's got a will of his own that's distinct from the divine will. And he's not enslaved by the divine mind, because he retains human free will. However, his human free will always does this. He always wills the same thing with his divine will and his human will, happily, because if he didn't, who knows what would happen? He'd split in two or something. He'd be like Steve Martin in The Jerk. They always align with each other. So this is what John of Damascus says. They always align with each other because Jesus's human mind is perfectly virtuous. So the one respect in which Jesus's human soul differs from everyone else's is that he's sinless, right? He never sins. He never wants to sin. He may feel temptation to sin. He may feel human desires to sin, but they are never. He never acts on them.
But that's not because of his divine nature. That's just a part of his human nature.
It's a part of his human nature, but it is because his human nature has always existed as united to the divine. So it's always like developed that way, if you like. So because Jesus only wills what is right, he will never will anything that is at odds with his divine will. So it's
but
not
that sounds like his human nature is determined by his divine nature, because if it's grown up with or developed with his divine nature in some case, then it's determined by its divine nature.
Perhaps. Yeah. Perhaps.
But that seems like you wouldn't have free will anymore.
Only if you think that free will is incompatible with determinism.
So would this view necessitate abandoning libertarian free will?
It seems to me that it would. I mean, I don't think in the Christian tradition it typically has meant that. But yeah, I think that would be a reasonable conclusion. I mean, I think that if you believe in libertarian free will, if you're wrong, in other words, not to prejudice anyone against what I'm saying, but it's clearly wrong. If you believe in libertarian free will and you accept this model of Christ as having two minds, then even a perfectly sinless human Jesus might will, all sorts of things. There's no way of knowing what he's going. It's going to be random, effectively. So I don't see how there could be any way of guaranteeing that his human mind is going to will the same things that his divine mind does. It just looks like they're just going to. Who knows?
And that seems to cause another problem on the other end too, because if you no longer need the ability to do otherwise, libertarian free will, to be human, then what was the point of the apple?
The fruit, you mean? It's not an apple in the Bible.
It was an apple, and Jesus was white, and he looked like Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Yeah, well, I mean, he looked like Obi-Wan Kenobi because obviously, I mean, and when I say Obi-Wan Kenobi, I mean Alec Guinness Obi-Wan Kenobi, okay, the proper Obi-Wan Kenobi. Well, when you raise that question, you are assuming a very, dare I say it, evangelical view of what the fall was. You're assuming that it's all about free will, libertarian free will at that, and that is quite that's not a mainstream Christian view, at least. The Bible never talks about free will. That's not a phrase you ever find in the Bible. And of course, plenty of Christians have denied the existence of free will altogether, including Luther and Calvin, and quite important people like that. So yes, if you abandon libertarian free will, then you can't mythologize around the story of the fall as being a story about the misuse of libertarian free will. But there's no rule that says that Christians are obliged to interpret it in that way to start with. Evangelicals and other prominent Christians typically do interpret it in that way today, but that is just one particular Christian tradition, and not one that I think Christians should be particularly wedded to.
So if we accepted this as a coherent definition of the Incarnation, how many Christian views actually have a coherent definition of the Incarnation?
So the view that I've kind of badly articulated and sort of defended as coherent is what I would call like the mainstream classical view of incarnation. And it's the view that goes back at least to Cyril of Alexandria and goes through people like Thomas Aquinas, and is kind of assumed by certainly all Catholic theologians since then, and Orthodox with a capital O, and quite a lot of Protestants as well.
Wait a minute, because I think most of them adopt libertarian free will. Most of them adopt the reason that we need the apple thing is because of this free will thingy. I think don't most of them.
No. You're running two things together there. It's one thing to say that we have libertarian free will, which has indeed been the mainstream view in most Christian theology outside the Reformed Church. But don't confuse that with the claim that the fall was all about the misuse of libertarian free will, or that God created Adam and Eve, or whatever Adam and Eve are supposed to be a metaphor for, with the intention of giving us libertarian free will so that we should use it one way rather than another. That's different.
Oh, right. So the contradiction I'm outlining is the free will and the incarnation being the way you described it seem contradictory, and most Christians seem to adopt both of those, or attempt to.
I would be inclined to agree with that. I think that the question of Christ's human will and how it relates to his divine will is pretty much the most difficult and most obscure part of this whole picture. And I'm not convinced that there really is a way to make it coherent without adopting either, well, some kind of compatibilist view of free will. But then, I mean, think of what Augustine says about free will. Okay, Augustine says, if you are only able to perform bad deeds, then you're in a pretty bad situation, right? That is not a good state to be in. A better state than that is to have the ability to perform either good or bad deeds. In other words, in a libertarian sense. So you have libertarian free will where you could do good or you could do wrong. That's better than being in a state where you can only do wrong. But better than that is being in a state where you can only do what's right. So Augustine thought that in heaven, the blessed, they lack libertarian free will. They can only do what is right. And he thought that that is a higher kind of freedom than the ability to do good or evil. So, and I mean, Augustine was writing kind of before all of this stuff I'm talking about was really codified. But an Augustinian, and Augustinianism is like the dominant theological trend in the Western Church since forever, could say, you and I have libertarian free will, and sadly we misuse it all the time. But a perfect human being would not have libertarian free will, because libertarian free will is not the highest perfection. A higher perfection than libertarian free will is a state of being unable to do what's wrong, because you only desire what is right. You are free from the pull of concupiscence and sinful desire. You've got rid of all of that, you're free of them, and now you only want what is right, and that is the only thing that you can ever do. And that is a better state to be in than being constantly pulled about between good and evil. So an Augustinian theologian could say Jesus is like that, right? Because he's a perfect human being. One could consistently say, all human beings, almost all human beings, have libertarian free will. Jesus, however, did not have libertarian free will, but that wasn't a defect in him. That was a sign of the fact that he's better. He's a better kind of human, if you like.
I feel like that would contradict most Christians' view that having libertarian free will is a better good. That's the reason God allows suffering. He wants us to have the greater good.
You're saying most Christians. That's not true. I don't think it's true that most Christians think that. I mean, it may be true that most of the Christians whose views you hear loudly today think that, but they are not representative of Christianity as a whole. And they're certainly not representative of Christianity historically. Historically, that's not how Christians have typically dealt with the problem of evil and how they've interpreted Adam and Eve and so on. It's not. And like I say, what I've just described is the view of St. Augustine. Now, St. Augustine is not a marginal figure in Christian theology. He is the single most influential Christian theologian and thinker, and arguably the most influential person at all after the formation of the New Testament in Western thought, right? So this is, I'm not citing some obscure idea to get out of it here. I'm citing someone central. So yeah, don't be so quick to think that Christians are all cut from the same cloth. And yeah, I agree. Many Christians today, especially evangelical Christians, who typically do make free will, libertarian free will, a really, really, really important thing. Foolishly, I think, because I don't think that idea can sustain can do the job that they want it to do. I think they would disagree with what I've just said, but that's not because they're Christians. It's because they are that particular kind of Christian. But that's not the only kind of Christianity that's available, fortunately.
Gotcha. Well, we have been going for a little over an hour. It was a great conversation. Really appreciate you coming on. Do you want to give any links or references where people can find out more about your work?
Yeah, you can find me at if you type my name in with the University of Exeter, you will find my page there, which tells you some of the things that I've done in the past, but I've not been keeping up to date. Also, because I'm a cool kid, I have joined Mastodon, which is what all the cool kids are doing these days. And you can find me at JonathanCR at sunny.garden. So I've been making pointless observations there about stuff that's got nothing to do with this. So yeah, feel free if people have questions to get in touch. And
awesome.
Thank you for having me. Twice. It's been really good.
Absolutely, it was a great conversation. Really appreciate you having on. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, and you too.